Good morning one more time. Thank you so much for joining. And I am looking forward to engaging you in another discussion on the critique of Jamaican independence. Remember, yesterday we asked the question, is Jamaica an independent nation, as many of our politicians are saying, including many of our academic elites. Now, it's important for you to understand that our academic elites are also a part of the elites in Jamaica. You have your financial elites, the 21 families that own the country, right? Who are the major family structures, the major families that control that nation. We have our political elites, right? And these financial elites often they control the political elites, right? Because they have to swear to protect their financial interests. We also have the academic elites, right? And primarily at our major universities, their particular University of the West Indies, which continues um, to uphold and to solidify and to cement the status quo. So that is what we need to understand. Now, we're not saying that all persons and all professors at the University of the West Indies belong to that elite class, right? Because, you have those who might not be in agreement and they are independent enough not to form that elite structure and might sometimes criticize the elite structure. But, if they are a threat to the system, they could be relieved of their positions too, right? So we have to understand that. The elites do not tolerate, what should I say, disobedience, right? And dissent for the most part. It's very important that you follow in the direction that they want the country to be led into. Now, yesterday I made a few mistakes. I talked about the austere conditions, and I used the word austeric, but there's no word called austeric, right? The word is austere, right? The austere conditionalities of the IMF. Remember, we talked about the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and the fact that they implement austere conditionalities in Jamaica, programs in which that they ask you to reduce your debt, but in order to reduce your debt, they actually implement strategies or economic tactics in which the country cannot be able to sustain itself, right? It cannot pay its bills, right? Its social programs, they are not able to invest in social programs, in the social infrastructure in that country. For example, healthcare or education, right? Or welfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is what we mean by austere conditionalities. And we know that, as we said, in 2013, when Jamaica re-engaged to the IMF and they went into an agreement, that the agreement was so austere that it was deemed to be, even by international academics, to be the most austere program ever in the history of the IMF. And there are still Jamaicans who consider that to be okay and that the country is succeeding under that sort of agreement, under that sort of arrangement. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what governs that sort of thinking, but it cannot be because the IMF does not have a reputation for for its economic recommendations, right? They've always allowed countries to suffer immensely. And instead of progressing, they often regress, right? So it's important that you understand that. Um, there was something else I said. I might not, as I go forward, I will. Oh, I think I thought I think I used the thought thing, but I did use a double negative. I think in the paragraph when it says, that we will never, or something that we will never, or that Jamaica won't ever. I think I said won't never. Remember now that double negatives are not used in English, and sometimes maybe I'm thinking Spanish, right? And we're in double negatives and even triple negatives are allowed in that language, right? But English doesn't allow double negatives. So that might be a wrong thought process. So please forgive me for that sort of error that I made yesterday. I think I was reading from his speech, and he did have the correct English, the standard English. I was somewhat misread it and ended up making grammatical error where that is concerned. So please forgive me. Thank you so much for your understanding. Now, let's pull back up here the article that we were reading from Norman Gervon, right? Norman Gervon. Remember, he's an intellectual, Jamaican intellectual who largely taught at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. So he was born in Jamaica, educated in Jamaica, but spent most of his life in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. Now, Norman Gervon, many of the articles I read about him, his biographical sketch, his biographical information, talked about how much of a regionalist he was. And so he was born in Jamaica, taught in Trinidad, had most of his professional life in Trinidad, and he died in a Cuban hospital. So it shows you how he traverses the a wide spectrum, a wide gamut of the Caribbean region. And I didn't even know that he also was involved in the whole Dominican Haitian spat that they had some years ago when over 200,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent were going to be denationalized and to be stripped of their Dominican citizenship. And he was also involved in defending the cause of those people, the rights of those people. That was interesting. Now, let's go on. I think if I'm not lying, I have read a few of his articles, a few of his scholarly journal articles. And if I'm not lying, if I can remember clearly, I think he does speak some Spanish and Portuguese, right? I think Norman Gilbert did speak some Spanish and Portuguese. If he did not, somebody can correct me, but I think he had some amount of fluency in those languages, or that his work, the work that he did was the works, I should say, the academic, publications were translated into those languages. Now, yesterday we talked about, the historic understanding of how Jamaica became independent and the fact that our politicians were, that's primarily Bustamante and what's his name again, and Norman Manley, that they, went to England and instead of rewriting a constitution that suits Jamaican reality, they actually, just decided to, use a constitution that was still colonial in orientation and principle. And so they recycled the constitution and, and just came to Jamaica, even though the constitution did not fit the reality of an independent nation. We understood that their quest that was given to them by their mandate that was given to them by the British monarchy, the then Queen Elizabeth II, was to just continue this in the status quo and not to change, not to disrupt the status quo. So it's very important that we understand that Jamaica's quest, its goal is not to defend the cause of the Jamaican people, but to maintain the status quo, right? And that's for the elite classes there, that's the local oligarchy, and for their international allies. Let's put it that way, right? So that's all I need to say. And oftentimes, even when the United States as an empire uses the word allies, that's what they mean. Financial interests, military interests, right? It doesn't have to do with the fact that we're friends and we're chummy, right? It's just that we want to maintain our financial and our military interests. So they say that we're allies, but they can become enemies tomorrow because, as we know, friends, sometimes when it talks about money is the surest thing to divide friends, right? And to dismantle friendships. Now let's get into the periods of the 1970s, according to what Gervon is giving here. He said, let us return to the Jamaican case in the 1970s. the government of Mr. Michael Manley introduced wide-ranging social reforms, redistributed income, and expanded state control over the economy. It took steps to address the social debt that was a legacy of 200 years of colonialism, slavery, and the plantation system. So Michael Manley was the one who wanted to wanted to disrupt that system, the status quo, right? And he wanted to redistribute the wealth and to ensure that Jamaicans, the masses, had some amount of the pie, that they were eating some amount of the pie. However, the fact of the matter is that the local oligarchy and their international allies did not see eye to eye with that person. Now, we have to understand that Michael Manley was a part of the elites, but it's one of the ironies of history is that it's when you're talking about the disruption of the status quo, it's always one of the elites that tend to be at the helm, right? Very rarely. If Marcus Garvey had been successful in Jamaica, then he perhaps would be different, right? Because he wasn't coming from the elite class, right? We know he was coming from the lower stratum of society. So if he had become prime minister, then he would have been the ultimate. So, but at least he was the greatest leader, the greatest Black leader that we have ever seen in our times. Now, the empire and the local oligarchy struck back, right? So when we talk about the empire, who do you think Gervin is referring to? Definitely the United States, because this was in the 1970s and Great Britain had already lost its empire. So this would be the US empire. And I'm wondering why he just did not state that, because, we don't want to be confused here that by that time, the British Empire would have died, right? Because it died around about 1955, right? So this is definitely referring to the United States. The empire and the local oligarchy struck back. Mr. Manley's experiment was crippled by capital flight, shrinking export revenues, and IMF-mandated austerity. By the end of 1980, he had been voted out of office. It was back to business as usual, which means that the elites were controlling and they did not want the masses, right, to be a part of the wide or the broader agenda. Correct? So we have to understand that. So and that agenda has been maintained up until now, right? Because I think that anybody who even wanted to contest that sort of status quo and to disrupt it, they would have learned their lessons, right, from the events of 1970s, from 1972 or particularly 1976, leading into 1980. They would have learned their lesson that they cannot contest the empire and the local elites, the local oligarchy on Jamaican soil. The late Cornerstone theorized Jamaican politics as a system of patronage and clientelism, right? And that's what it's really about. Electors, especially those in constituencies consisting of the poor and socially excluded, exchange their votes for jobs and other benefits. That's what they do. And that's what they continue to do, right? Nothing has changed since then. Where there is not enough for everyone, inter-party violence often results. And notice that Carl Stone, based on what I have read about him, he seemed to have been one of Jamaica's finest intellectuals, right? And he, in that era, seemed to have been one of the few ones, right? The few intellectuals, particularly those who were living on the soil in Jamaica, who seemed to just write frankly and candidly about the system, right? And I don't know if you want to say he was PNP or I don't know what political affiliation he belonged to. But I do know that when you read his works, that he strove at that time, right, to render a balanced and nuanced perspective on what was happening in Jamaica and particularly in the political and social realm. A former Prime Minister, P.J. Patterson, said in a moment of candor that Jamaican politics consisted of warring tribes vying for scarce benefits. And that was said by Mr. P.J. Patterson. And that's exactly what has not ended. right? And no one can disrupt that particular dynamic, right? That is on the that's on the island. Now, look at what he says here, but Stone went further. He saw a trend in the 1980s where the fiscal crisis of the state was drying up the flow of benefits to supporters of the political party in power. Drug dons were stepping in to fill the breach. He predicted that this would be a game changer in Jamaican politics. The tail would end up wagging the dog. And that's exactly what happened, right? And he's now going to forward to 2010. And, those of us who are Jamaicans, we know that what happened in 2010. Fast forward to 2010. Christopher Dudus Polk, wanted in the United States for drug and gun running, had long since established a stronghold in the constituency, then represented by the Prime Minister himself, Mr. Golding in Tivoli Gardens. Dudus ran things. I mean, and for those of you who don't understand this Jamaican lingo, it means he ran the show. He was the one who was in charge of things in that, constituency. And we have for over 9 months, Golding's administration refused to act on an extradition request from the United States government. When he eventually caved in under pressure, there was a virtual urban insurrection in his own constituency in support of the wanted drug lord. Now, while Golding was also deliberating, and he refused to act on the expedition as Gervin is saying, but there's more to the story, right? We know that, the United States had sent an extradition request to him, and, we understand, as Gervin is saying, that he had no choice but to defend Christopher Dudus Polk, as Christopher Dudus Polk ran the show in that constituency. But the US also wanted to, they were not in alliance or in agreement, I should say, with Jamaica's domestic laws as regards surveillance, right? So they had some evidence in which they had, secretly surveilled by phone, tapping phone lines and so forth, which is illegal in Jamaica and Jamaican constitution. And the fact that they had wiretapped him and Jamaican laws doesn't allow that, my understanding, then Golding was saying that if they had other evidence apart from the evidence that they had constructed, he'd be willing to give him over. But it was just a bit back and forth, and it was very difficult for them. And, the United States is an empire, so they will get what they desire, right? And that's what happened. Eventually, Dudus was sent abroad, right? So it was a long, difficult moment. Well, it wasn't, it was short, but it was like eternity because many people died. Jamaica was exposed to the kind of international media attention that is the tourist board's nightmare. It is true, Dudus became one of the most instantly recognizable Jamaican faces in the world's media, eclipsed only, unfortunately, by the likes of Bob Marley and Usain Bolt. Dudus himself escaped and gave himself up several weeks later. In the United States, he pleaded guilty to racketeering, conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit assault with a dangerous weapon in aid of racketeering. He's now serving a 23-year jail sentence. Now, it's interesting to note, when I see the word conspiracy here, that our politicians tend to believe that it's these guys who are engaged in conspiracy, and they are not, right? So we're seeing here he's guilty of racketeering and also conspiracy to commit assault, right? And these were done in secret, right? But the government operates in transparency. Golding was forced to call an early election the following year, which he promptly lost, right? So all of that is history. And we saw where the PNP won that election as the People's National Party. Now, he went into talking about Trinidad. I'm not going to get into bore you with that information. And he was saying the same thing about Trinidad, that Trinidad is also enwrapped, right, entangled in a lot of corruption, right? And they too were heading, they were declining, and their state was not also transparent as it should be. And the goals that they thought would have been achieved in the 1962 or so, are dreams deferred. But I will not bore you with that. Now, he talks about the fact that uh, let's look at in many regional countries, export revenues have not kept pace with imports, newly liberalized. Tax revenues have not kept pace with government spending. Debt ratios have grown steeply. New threats and new demands on government's resources have emerged with bewildering speed rather. We now have to cope with the effects of transnational organized crime and of global climate change. And he says, I will not try your patience by reciting a whole lot of facts and figures. A convenient way to sum up the situation is to report that the Caribbean is one of the highest regions globally on a number of indicators. And look at what he's saying here. Debt burden, more than twice that of Latin America. Migration rates between 2/3 and 90% of the annual output of skilled manpower. That's not good. Economic dependence on remittances, fastest growing sources of foreign currency earnings, greater than ODA and FDI, 3 times the value of agricultural exports. Murder rates over 30 per 100,000 and highest of all the regions in the world, along with other sins among the countries with the highest degree of vulnerability to climate change in relation to population and land area. Now, when we look at the migration rates, right, and we look at the economic dependence and remittances, I would leave you to decide if our economies are doing much better. I don't see how we could be doing better than 1962, 70s, 80s, when that is happening. Because if most of your skilled workers, your educated force, right, are leaving right to other countries, there's no way that your country is going to grow. And this has been on an upward spiral, maybe from the in Jamaica, from the 1970s, right? We've been having loads of brain drain, right? So you must decide if you think the country can improve, or or these countries have improved rather. Um, I don't think so. I think it's obvious that they are going to decline, right? Because they need the human resources, the skilled labor force to be able to improve on their situation, their economic and social situation in these countries. On a brighter side, we do have the highest per capita production in the world of medal-winning athletes. So that's what we are concerned about, right? We are concerned about sports and entertainment, and that is what our elites use to wield their power over us. And they say, well, we are one of the best countries in the world because we have produced Usain Bolt and Shelley and Fraser Price and all of these wonderful elite athletes, right? We have produced them, and that is what gives us our glory. But as I said yesterday in our video, that no country has ever been built by sports, or can we depend on sports personalities to uplift our culture and our economic development? That will not be possible. And we probably the highest per capita production of carnivals, right? So it's again, it's entertainment. That's what we like. That's what we tend to view as, important factors in their growth and development. But people who are more serious understand that that is not going to work. Now, look at what Dr. Peter Phillips is saying here, and I think he mentioned this in 2013 in an article. He says here, economic realities have turned, well, this is Gerben saying this, and then he will be quoting Dr. Peter Phillips. Economic realities have turned national sovereignty into an illusion. It's a legal formality that is increasingly devoid of substance. Dr. Peter Phillips, Minister of Finance in Jamaica, he says, and I'm going to quote from Dr. Peter Phillips, we have not managed our sovereignty well, and the first requirement of sovereignty is the ability to manage your own affairs and pay your own way in the world, and we haven't done that well, right? So it means, therefore, that Dr. Peter Phillips is saying that we haven't really managed our sovereignty well. And perhaps he won't say that, but I think to some extent we've lost, if not most of our sovereignty, all of our sovereignty. right? Now, he's now asking to go forward. How do we go forward? He says, can the national project be rescued? What is the meaning of sovereignty to countries like ours in the new global order? And what is the role of regionalism going forward? And where does the Westminster system fit into all of this? So he's asking the questions, how are we going to move forward when we are losing in many aspects our sovereignty? These questions are posed very sharply. It would appear that we are at some kind of historical turning point, like the 1830s and 1930s, when the old system was crumbling, but the shape of the one to replace it is still to be clearly defined. So the system, as Michael Manley, is unraveling. Michael Manley said, the years before that, the entire country of Jamaica was unraveling. And I would say the entire Caribbean region at large was unraveling. Now, it's a very difficult and complex question. But let me continue. Over 50 years ago, C.N.R. James excited many like myself with his vision of the possibilities of creating Athenian type democracies in small societies like ours. Right? So that is what he was talking about, the minister, the Caribbean intellectual. Now, he was talking about our democracies, right? Now, let us end here because I don't want to. Our beloved Trinidad and Tobago is a state of crisis manifesting itself in various forms. The system of governance itself has failed. Our post-colonial state has collapsed. There is a feeling of lost hope where the country seems to be spiraling out of control, degenerating into barbarism. And this is what um, he's saying. Now, this is what our forefathers fought and died for. They did not fight to create a society based on individualism. They did not fight for self-governance so that some politicians can pillage and plunder the treasury, enriching themselves. They certainly did not fight to build a country where party financiers reign supreme. This is the kind of country we see being constructed, right? And that is what is happening in our countries where financial powers are controlling political interests and therefore they control our government. Now, we have to decide whether or not we are free, right? We can't have our politicians. Some of us like to see our politicians running around, going to different conferences and signing off on different international or economic agreements. But we, the citizens, must decide if we are free or not. The politicians cannot decide that for us because they're not representing our interests, right? And it's time for us to understand that, time for many Jamaicans to wake up and to understand that the not the PJ Pat, the PNP or the JLP will not be able to save or to salvage Jamaica from the present situation that they are in. I mean, with God's help, we can try to seek his wisdom and to see where we go from here. But at this point in time, no political leader is going to be able to salvage Jamaica from the situation that we find ourselves in. Right. So thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in the next chat.